The rain had not stopped for 3 days when Eleanor Whitmore arrived at Blackmere Hall. The carriage wheels rolled slowly through the mud, past dead hedges and iron gates stained dark with age. Beyond them stood the manor itself, enormous and silent beneath the silver evening sky. Narrow windows reflected weak candlelight, and ivy climbed the stone walls like old veins across pale skin. Eleanor pressed her gloved hand against the cold glass of the carriage window and watched the house appear through the fog. She had not seen Blackmere Hall in 12 years, not since the funeral of her mother. The coachman cleared his throat softly and opened the door for her. Rain whispered against her black coat as she stepped onto the gravel path. Somewhere in the distance, a raven cried once, then vanished into silence. The front door opened before she could knock. A tall servant stood inside holding a brass candle holder. His face was narrow and pale, his gray hair carefully combed behind his ears. He bowed slightly. "Miss Whitmore," he said quietly, "your uncle has been expecting you." The warmth of the hall wrapped around her at once. The scent of burning oak, wet wool, and old books filled the air. Eleanor removed her gloves slowly, while her eyes wandered across the dark interior. Portraits lined the walls from floor to ceiling, their painted faces watching her with expressions too distant to understand. The grandfather clock near the staircase ticked heavily through the silence. "Is my uncle awake?" Eleanor asked. "He is in the west drawing room," the servant replied. "Though I should warn you, miss, his health has become rather fragile." Eleanor nodded without surprise. The letter she had received 4 days earlier already carried the weight of illness between its careful lines. Her uncle, Theodore Whitmore, had summoned her back to Blackmere Hall after years without contact. No explanation, no apology, only a request written in trembling ink: "Come home before the winter begins." She followed the servant through endless corridors lit by candles, trembling inside glass covers. Rain tapped softly against the tall windows. Every sound inside the manor felt restrained, as if the house itself feared disturbing old memories. At last the servant opened a wooden door. Heat from the fireplace spilled across the corridor. Theodore Whitmore sat alone in a high velvet chair beside the fire. Age had reduced him sharply. His once broad shoulders had become thin beneath a dark wool blanket, and deep shadows rested beneath his eyes. Yet his gaze remained intelligent, steady, and strangely cautious. He looked at Eleanor for a long moment without speaking. Then he smiled faintly. "You have your mother's eyes," he said. Eleanor remained still near the doorway. "You wrote that it was urgent." Theodore glanced toward the fire. "Yes," he answered quietly. "Because someone inside this house has been lying to this family for nearly 20 years. The fire cracked softly between them while rain drifted against the tall windows of the drawing room. Eleanor remained standing for several seconds, studying her uncle's face in the amber light. Theodore Whitmore looked exhausted, yet there was something restless beneath his calm expression, as though sleep had abandoned him long ago. He motioned quietly toward the chair across from him. Eleanor sat down slowly, placing her gloves beside a silver tea tray untouched by either of them. "What exactly do you mean?" she asked. Theodore lowered his eyes toward the flames. "Your mother did not leave Blackmere Hall willingly." The words settled heavily into the room. Eleanor felt her fingers tighten against the armrest. For years she had believed the story repeated by every relative in the family. Her mother had argued with Theodore after the death of Eleanor's father, then chosen to leave the estate forever. No one had spoken much about it afterward. In Blackmere Hall, silence always replaced discomfort. "She told me herself that she wished to leave," Eleanor said carefully. Theodore nodded once. "Yes, because someone convinced her she had no other choice." The old clock near the bookshelf groaned quietly before striking 9. Each metallic note echoed through the room like distant footsteps in an empty corridor. Theodore leaned back weakly in his chair. "There are matters hidden inside this house that should have been revealed many years ago. I was a coward then. I believed silence protected the family name. His voice lowered further. Now I am no longer certain whom I was. Protecting Eleanor. Watched the firelight move across the dark wood walls. The manor suddenly felt smaller than before, its warmth less comforting. Who lied? She asked. Theodore opened his mouth to answer, but a sharp knock interrupted him. The servant entered carrying a folded letter on a silver tray. Forgive me, sir, he said quietly. This arrived for Miss Whitmore a few moments ago. Eleanor frowned. For me? The servant handed her the envelope. There was no address written upon it, only her name in narrow black ink. The paper itself felt strangely cold in her hands. Theodore's expression changed the moment he saw it. Not fear exactly, but recognition. Eleanor broke the seal carefully. Inside rested a single sheet containing only one sentence. She read it twice before looking up. Ask your uncle what truly happened in the East Wing. During the winter of 1889, silence filled the room completely. Even the fire seemed quieter now. Theodore closed his eyes slowly and whispered something Eleanor could barely hear. I prayed those letters would never begin again. The drawing room remained silent long after Theodore spoke. Rain slid slowly down the windows while the fire cast trembling shadows across the ceiling. Eleanor held the letter tightly between her fingers, unable to pull her eyes away from the thin black handwriting. Letters, she repeated quietly. You have received others before this. Theodore stared into the flames without answering immediately. His face looked older now, worn down not by illness alone but by memory itself. They began shortly after your mother left Blackmere Hall, he finally said. Always unsigned. Always arriving during storms. Eleanor placed the letter carefully onto the table, beside the untouched teacups. Why did you never tell anyone? Theodore gave a faint bitter smile. Because every letter contained details nobody outside this family should have known. A sudden gust of wind-pressed rain against the windows hard enough to make the glass tremble. Somewhere deeper inside the manor, a door closed heavily. Eleanor glanced toward the corridor instinctively. Blackmere Hall seemed full of distant sounds tonight, soft movements hidden beneath the storm. Theodore noticed her expression. This house carries echoes strangely, he murmured. Especially after midnight. Eleanor rose slowly from her chair and walked toward the fireplace. Above the mantel hung a portrait of her grandmother, painted in dark green silk with a stern expression, and pale, hands folded carefully in her lap. Even as a child, Eleanor had disliked the painting. The woman's eyes seemed observant, almost accusing. What happened in the East Wing? Eleanor asked without turning around. Theodore's breathing became uneven for a moment. A death, he answered quietly. Officially, it was declared an accident. Eleanor turned back toward him. Officially, Theodore reached for the silver cane resting beside his chair. His hand trembled slightly. There was a maid named Clara Belleyoung. Quiet. Your mother was very fond of her. One winter evening Clara fell from the upper gallery staircase in the East Wing. At least that is what everyone claimed. Eleanor felt cold, despite the heat of the fire. You believe otherwise. Theodore looked toward the closed door of the drawing room as if afraid someone stood listening outside. I believe Clara Belle discovered something she should not have discovered. Before Eleanor could speak again, another sound interrupted them. Footsteps slipped and measured across the corridor. Beyond the door, Theodore straightened immediately in his chair. The footsteps stopped. Silence followed. Then came 3 soft knocks against the wood. Neither of them moved. The servant had knocked differently earlier, faster and more certain. These knocks sounded deliberate, almost patient. Theodore lowered his voice to barely a whisper. Do not open the door. Eleanor stared at him in confusion. Who is it? The knocking did not return within the time period requested, causing Eleanor and Theodore to remain quiet for about a full minute. Additionally, the slow rain and the fire's quivering breath against the windows only added to the somber atmosphere that was permeating throughout the room. Theodore stood up hesitantly from his chair, leaning his silver cane upon his shoulder. His voice was soft and tender as he asked, "Stay here," he whispered softly, not addressing Eleanor directly. Eleanor responded to his direction by following him across the room silently, tiptoeing cautiously towards the door. He hesitated for a moment, uncertain if there was someone following them, so he opened the door wider. The empty, dimly lit passage beyond led directly to the staircase, with shadows stretching across the dark, slightly worn-out carpet under the continuous flickering candlelight. No footsteps or any specific movement were heard coming from either direction. Eleanor paused beside her uncle, carefully peering into the empty doorway. "There is no one here," she declared firmly. Theodore looked down the empty hallway with uncertainty, scrutinizing the envelope resting flat on the floor. His gaze locked upon the wax seal inside the envelope, which resembled a delicate flower. The letter within contained handwriting that matched the first letter of his confession. Theodore hesitated for a moment before confessing everything. After Clara Bell's death, your mother experienced fearful moments as she felt she should protect the safety of someone residing within this house. He lowered his voice dramatically, speaking with a level of detail that shocked Eleanor. She concealed things with the idea of shielding herself from danger, he continued. Eleanor stared up at him in disbelief, feeling completely overwhelmed by what Theodore had revealed. Who exactly was it, Uncle? Theodore raised his voice, raising the questions that she felt she needed to ask. I am certain it is something you are eager to know as well. He leaned back in his chair, worn from what he had already spoken. The moment the curtains flickered as the grandfather clock struck the hour of 10. Eleanor looked up nervously from their conversation. The empty east wing of Blackmere Hall that had been abandoned for years before, with only storage rooms accessible after sunset, once hosted the music room. It's the place she felt safe when she was a child, a sense of comfort that was shattered by the tragic death of Clara Bell. As Theodore spoke, he looked deep into the now rapidly fading fireplace, searching for an answer to the uncertainty that lingered beneath the shadows. The storm deepened as midnight approached, with wind and mournful sounds moving through the old manor, slipping beneath doors and stirring curtains along dark corridors. Eleanor stood beside her bedroom window, unable to sleep. The conversation with Theodore was endless, and Clara Bell surfaced. The East Wing, her mother's hidden key. Everything was altered by secrets she had never noticed before. Her room had about burned low when a servant knocked on her door, bearing a candle holder with a small brass key wrapped in a handkerchief. Eleanor recognized her mother's initial Z.W. upon arriving. The servant did not see anyone leave the east corridor. Curiosity gained strength, and Eleanor, wrapped in a dark wool coat, and ventured into the empty east wing. Blackmere Hall slept beneath silence, with only distant clock ticks echoing and old wooden groans. The candlelight flickered on the empty corridors and old, dusty furniture. Eleanor approached a large portrait of a dark-haired woman by the riverbank, pressed her fingers against the door to unlock it. A silent metallic click sounded from the room itself. Opening the door, she found a small lock within the wall, suggesting that someone else had stashed a key. This knowledge sent chills down her spine, fueling her curiosity. Next, she sensed a door opening softly in the dark. Curiosity and fear swelled, and her heart pounded. Eventually, she entered the music room that felt eerily familiar despite being centuries old. The curtains hung heavily, and dust clung to the faded carpets. Under moonlight and candlelight, the portrait of a woman in shadows stood against the far wall. Eleanor froze beside the portrait as a strange sound echoed through the music room. Candlelight trembled in her hand, while rain struck the windows and her heartbeat filled the silence. Then the sound returned, soft creaking from behind the wall near the old piano. She crossed the room carefully. Dust covered the floorboards untouched for years, but near the piano faint curved. Marks cut through the dust as if something heavy had recently been dragged away. Eleanor lowered the candle toward the wall paneling and noticed one uneven section. The moment she pressed against it, the hidden panel shifted inward. A narrow passage opened before her. Cold air drifted out, carrying the scent of stone, old paper, and extinguished candles. Every instinct warned her to leave. Wake Theodore, and wait for daylight. Yet another feeling pulled her. Forward, the certainty that her mother had once stood exactly where she stood now. Holding the candle high, Eleanor stepped inside. The hidden staircase descended beneath the east wing through rough stone walls barely wide, enough for one person. Somewhere far below, water dripped steadily. With every step, the storm above faded until only silence remained. At the bottom, she discovered a hidden chamber beneath. Blackmere Hall, shelves crowded with old books, boxers, and yellowed documents lined the walls. A writing desk stood beside a cold fireplace. Though abandoned, the room still carried signs of recent use. A folded blanket on the chair, dried pens beside ink bottles, papers carefully arranged. Then Eleanor noticed a framed photograph. She stepped closer slowly. The picture showed her mother beside a young woman Eleanor had never seen before. Both smiled beneath summer sunlight near the river outside. Blackmere Hall, on the back. Faded ink read, Vivian and Clara. Summer, 1888. Eleanor touched the glass lightly. Clara Bell looked calm and intelligent, more companion than servant. Then another detail caught Eleanor's attention. In the background, partly hidden among the trees, stood the blurred outline of a man. Even through the faded image, she recognized the silver-handled cane immediately. Theodore's cane. Suddenly a sound shattered the silence. Footsteps echoed above the chamber ceiling, slow and deliberate. Eleanor instantly extinguished her candle, and darkness swallowed the room. The footsteps stopped directly overhead. Then a door opened somewhere inside the east wing above her. Someone else was awake inside. Blackmere Hall. Someone who knew about the hidden room beneath the manor. Eleanor stood frozen in the darkness beneath. Blackmere Hall. The candle in her hand had gone cold while faint. Footsteps moved across the music room. Above her, slow, careful footsteps from someone who clearly knew the manor well. A drawer opened overhead, followed by the scrape of furniture across the floorboards. Whoever was upstairs was searching for something. Weak moonlight slipped through a narrow grate in the stone wall, revealing only shadows of shelves and scattered papers. Eleanor moved carefully toward the desk, avoiding loose boards beneath her feet. The photograph remained hidden inside her pocket, beside her mother's key. Then, the hidden panel near the staircase creaked softly. Her breath caught instantly. Someone had discovered the passage. A dim candlelight appeared above and slowly descended the stone stairs. Desperate, Eleanor searched for a hiding place and slipped. Behind the shelves lining the far wall just before the figure entered the chamber. It was Mr. Graves. The quiet servant stepped into the room, holding a brass candle holder. Yet here beneath the manor, he seemed different. Upstairs he moved silently through the halls, like part of the shadows themselves. But down here his posture appeared calm and confident, as though the hidden chamber belonged to him. Graves approached the desk and immediately noticed the missing photograph. Eleanor pressed herself against the cold stone wall behind the shelves. After a long silence, he spoke softly. "Miss Whitmore," Eleanor's pulse quickened. "You should not hide from me. Your mother once did precisely the same thing." Slowly, Eleanor stepped out into the candlelight, refusing to appear frightened. Graves watched her carefully, his pale expression unreadable. You knew about this place all along, Eleanor whispered. For many years, Graves replied. Then you know what happened to Clara Bell. At Clara's name something darkened briefly in his face. He lowered the candle onto the desk. I know what this family allowed people to believe. Eleanor studied him closely. Why send the letters now? Graves looked genuinely confused. Letters. Silence filled the chamber, while water dripped faintly, somewhere deeper underground. Finally, he spoke again. Miss Whitmore, I did not send you anything. Cold fear spread through Eleanor's chest. But you knew my mother. You knew about this room? Yes, Graves answered quietly. Because your mother trusted me more than anyone else inside. Blackmere Hall. Then who sent the letters? Graves glanced uneasily toward the staircase. That, he whispered, is exactly why your uncle summoned you home. Before Eleanor could respond, another sound echoed from above. Not footsteps this time, but a door slamming violently somewhere in the east wing corridor. Graves immediately lifted the candle. His face had gone pale. Someone else is inside the house tonight, he whispered, and they were never meant to find this room. For several long seconds, neither Eleanor nor Graves moved. The hidden chamber beneath Blackmere Hall felt smaller as the storm groaned above the manor. Then footsteps echoed overhead again, slow, deliberate steps crossing the east wing corridor above the hidden staircase. Graves extinguished the candle immediately, plunging them into darkness. Only faint moonlight filtered through the narrow grate in the wall. Stay silent, he whispered. The footsteps paused above the concealed entrance. A floorboard creaked directly overhead. Someone stood inside the music room above them. Eleanor held her breath, until the footsteps finally continued deeper into the corridor. After several moments, Graves relit the candle. They're searching for something, he said quietly. Or for someone, Eleanor replied. Graves moved toward the shelves and removed a small wooden box hidden behind old books. Your mother left instructions, he said carefully. If anything happened to her, this was meant for you. Eleanor stared at him. She expected danger. Graves hesitated. Your mother believed Clara Bell's death was no accident. She became convinced someone inside Blackmere Hall hid the truth. Inside the box rested several letters, a silver locket, and a worn leather journal belonging to Eleanor's mother. The first pages described ordinary life at the estate, but gradually the entries darkened. Clara has become frightened. She overheard an argument in the East Gallery late at night. Another entry read, Clara begged me not to trust anyone inside the manor, except Graves. Eleanor turned another page. Tonight I discovered blood upon the staircase railing near the East Gallery. Though the servants insist, the corridor has remained locked since Clara's death. Eleanor slowly looked up. Theodore lied to me. Graves lowered his gaze. Your uncle protected this family through silence. Eleanor opened the silver locket. Inside were tiny photographs of her mother and Clara Bell. Hidden beneath them lay a folded slip of paper. She unfolded it carefully. Ask about the winter guest. Fear crossed Graves' face instantly. She should never have written that, he whispered. Eleanor stared at him. Who was the winter guest? Graves turned toward the dark shelves. A man who arrived shortly before Clara died. Who was he? After a long silence, Graves finally answered. A relative your uncle claimed had died years earlier. Before Eleanor could speak again, a violent crash exploded above them. Wood splintered inside the music room, followed by heavy footsteps rushing toward the hidden staircase. Someone had forced open the concealed entrance. The hidden chamber fell silent after the crash above. Eleanor stepped backward from the staircase while Graves raised the candle toward the ceiling. Dust drifted softly from the stone where the hidden panel had been forced open. Heavy footsteps crossed the music room overhead with calm confidence. They know about the passage now, Graves whispered. Eleanor clutched her mother's journal tightly. Is there another way out? Graves nodded and moved toward the rear wall where old shelves concealed a narrow iron door. A servant's tunnel leads toward the lower kitchens, he said quietly. Before he could open it, another sound echoed down the staircase. A familiar voice. You need not hide from me any longer. Eleanor froze instantly. Graves' face lost all color. Slow footsteps descended until a figure appeared holding a lantern. Theodore Whitmore. His silver cane rested firmly in one hand while exhaustion shadowed his pale face. His eyes moved immediately toward the journal in Eleanor's hands. So, he said softly, you found your mother's secrets. Graves stepped protectively in front of Eleanor. You should not have come here, sir. Theodore gave a tired smile. This was once my house. Graves, I know every hidden room beneath it. Eleanor stared at him. You lied to me. Theodore did not deny it, because the truth destroys families far more completely than silence ever could. Eleanor raised the journal slightly. Mother believed Clara Bell was murdered. Theodore closed his eyes briefly. Your mother believed many things after that winter. And were they true? After a long silence, Theodore finally answered. Partly. Graves stepped forward. You owe her the truth now. Pain crossed Theodore's face. Your mother misunderstood what happened. I tried to protect her. Eleanor's voice trembled. Protect her from whom? Theodore stared into the shadows. From my brother. Silence crashed through the chamber. Your brother died before I was born, Eleanor whispered. Theodore slowly shook his head. No, he disappeared. And during the winter of 1889, he returned to Blackmere Hall under another name. Eleanor struggled to breathe evenly as old family stories surfaced in her memory. Theodore lowered himself into the chair beside the desk. Clara Bell discovered his true identity, he said quietly. And after that winter night, fear poisoned everything inside this house. Then another sound echoed. Above them, the slow creak of a cane moving across the east wing floorboards. Theodore's face drained of color. Impossible, he whispered. No one else owns a cane like mine. The sound above the chamber continued slowly across the east wing. Floorboards. Tap. Pause. Tap again. The careful rhythm of a silver-handled cane moving through the corridor overhead. Theodore remained frozen beside the desk, his pale eyes fixed upon the ceiling as though memory itself had returned above them. Graves extinguished the candle immediately, leaving only dim lantern light trembling across the stone walls. It cannot be him, Theodore whispered. Eleanor tightened her grip around her mother's journal. Your brother, she said quietly. What was his name? Theodore closed his eyes briefly. Edmund Whitmore. Graves moved closer to the staircase, listening carefully. Above them, the footsteps stopped. Silence followed. Then came the slow creak of the hidden panel opening once more. Theodore struggled to rise from the chair. We must leave now. But before anyone moved, a voice descended softly from the darkness. Above, calm, cultured, older than yet unmistakably similar. After all these years, brother, you still prefer hiding underground. Cold spread sharply through Eleanor's chest. A figure appeared at the top of the staircase holding a lantern low beside him. Dark coat, gray gloves, silver hair carefully combed back. Then the man stepped fully into view. He looked remarkably like Theodore, though harder somehow, shaped by bitterness rather than age. Most unsettling of all was the cane in his hand, an exact twin to Theodore's own. Graves lowered his gaze immediately. Theodore stared upward in stunned silence. Edmund, he breathed. Edmund Whitmore descended the staircase slowly, every movement controlled and deliberate. I had hoped, Edmund said softly, that you might finally tell the girl the truth before I arrived. Eleanor struggled to speak. You were alive this entire time. Edmund's eyes moved toward her calmly. Yes, Miss Whitmore. Though your family preferred otherwise, Theodore's voice hardened. You should never have returned here. Edmund smiled faintly. And yet you summoned Eleanor back to Blackmere Hall yourself. Eleanor looked from one brother to the other. Theodore carried exhaustion, while Edmund carried control. Did you kill Clarabelle? Eleanor asked suddenly. Neither man answered immediately. Edmund removed his gloves slowly. No, he said quietly. But Clara died because she discovered what your mother and Theodore refused to face. Theodore gripped his cane tightly. Do not involve Vivian in this. Edmund ignored him and looked directly at Eleanor. Your mother loved this family too much to believe what Blackmere Hall truly was. Eleanor's pulse quickened. And what was it? Edmund's expression darkened. A prison built from reputation, fear, and lies. Then he placed an unopened letter upon the desk. Eleanor recognized the narrow black handwriting instantly. Edmund looked at her steadily. I sent the letters because your mother deserved to have someone finally uncover the truth about the night Clarabelle died. No one spoke for several moments after Edmund's confession. Rain whispered faintly through Blackmere Hall while the lantern flickered across tired faces and scattered papers. Eleanor stared at the unopened letter on the desk. Theodore finally rose from his chair with visible effort. You had no right to involve her. Edmund met his gaze calmly. She was already involved the moment Vivian died believing lies. Theodore's expression tightened. Painfully at Eleanor's mother's name, Eleanor looked toward Edmund. Why disappear for all these years? Edmund removed his gloves slowly. Because your uncle asked me to. Theodore closed his eyes briefly. That is not the entire truth. Edmund gave a cold smile. No, but it is the beginning. Eleanor stepped closer. Then tell me the rest. Edmund rested both hands upon his cane. I returned to Blackmere Hall in 1889 after years abroad. Theodore believed I had ruined the family through gambling debts and scandal. Theodore answered sharply. Because you had. Yes, Edmund admitted. But Clarabelle discovered something far more dangerous than my return. Eleanor's pulse quickened. What? Edmund looked directly at Theodore. That the Whitmore estate was nearly bankrupt. Silence filled the chamber. Theodore moved slowly toward the shelves, his cane echoing softly against the stone floor. Blackmere Hall was collapsing financially, he admitted. Taxes, debts, failed investments. If the truth spread publicly, the estate would have been lost within months. Edmund continued quietly. Clara overheard Theodore arguing with a solicitor in the East Gallery. She learned the truth before anyone else. Eleanor frowned. Why would that place her in danger? Graves finally spoke from the shadows. Because Clara intended to tell Vivian. Theodore lowered his gaze. Your mother believed Blackmere Hall represented stability. She would never have forgiven me for deceiving her. Eleanor felt the chamber grow colder. So Clara threatened the family secret. No, Edmund replied softly. Clara tried to protect Vivian from it. He paused, and someone panicked. The lantern flame trembled as wind moved through the hidden tunnels. Eleanor stared at Theodore. You still haven't told me who was with Clara. The night she died, neither brother answered immediately. Then Theodore finally spoke. I was Eleanor's breath caught. Theodore's pale face looked hollow beneath the lantern light. Clara begged me to tell Vivian the truth before someone else did. We argued in the East Gallery. His voice dropped lower. Then Vivian arrived unexpectedly. Edmund turned away into the shadows. The argument became worse. Eleanor's pulse quickened, and Clara fell. Theodore gripped his cane tightly. Yes, he whispered, but not because anyone pushed her. Eleanor was about to speak again when she noticed Graves standing motionless near the staircase. His eyes remained fixed toward the darkness above them. Then quietly he whispered, someone else is listening. The chamber fell silent at Graves' warning. Every face turned toward the staircase leading upward into darkness. The lantern flame trembled softly while rain whispered faintly through Blackmere Hall. Eleanor listened carefully. At first, she heard nothing. Then came the faint sound of breathing. Someone stood beyond the hidden entrance, listening from the music room above. Theodore straightened, despite the pain in his movements. "Who is there?" he called sharply. No answer came. Edmund raised his lantern higher. "Show yourself." Silence followed. Then slow footsteps crossed the floorboards, above the hidden panel, and retreated down the corridor. Graves moved first, climbing the staircase quickly. Theodore followed beside Edmund, while Eleanor stayed close behind, clutching her mother's journal tightly. When they emerged into the music room, the hidden panel stood open beside the piano. Cold air drifted through the dusty chamber while candlelight flickered faintly from the corridor outside. The room itself was empty. Graves hurried into the east wing corridor. Long shadows stretched across faded carpets while rain tapped softly against the tall windows overlooking the river grounds. Eleanor felt the oppressive stillness of the corridor more strongly than ever. Someone had stood there moments earlier, watching them. Theodore leaned heavily upon his cane and glanced toward the far end of the hall. "The gallery," he whispered. Edmund's expression darkened. "No." But Theodore had already started forward. Eleanor followed them until the east gallery opened before them, a long chamber overlooking the entrance. Hall below through dark wooden railings. Moonlight filtered weakly through tall windows, silver against the dust-covered floor. At the center of the gallery stood an old chair facing the river. Windows, empty beside it, rested a single white rose, freshly cut despite the winter storm outside. Graves bent slowly and lifted the rose. His pale expression changed instantly. This was Clara's favorite flower. Theodore leaned heavily against the railing, as though his strength had suddenly faded. Edmund looked toward the dark windows. "He used to leave white roses outside her room," he murmured. Eleanor turned sharply. "Who did?" Edmund answered quietly. "The man Clara trusted most." Silence settled over the gallery. Then Eleanor noticed faint scratches beneath the chair, hidden under years of dust. She knelt carefully and brushed the floorboards with trembling fingers. 3 initials appeared. CB. Theodore saw them too, and all color drained from his face. Beneath the initials another sentence slowly emerged. "He saw me fall." Eleanor looked up sharply. "You said Clara's death was an accident." Theodore breathing became uneven as he stared at the words. Edmund spoke softly behind him. "Because it was easier than admitting. Someone watched her die and chose silence instead." Heavy footsteps echoed once more through the entrance hall below, slow, measured, certain. Everyone in the east gallery remained frozen beneath dim candlelight while rain drifted softly against the tall windows. Theodore gripped the railing tightly, his breathing uneven. "No one was meant to come here tonight," he whispered. Edmund's face darkened. "Unless someone followed me." Graves moved toward the staircase. "Stay here," he said quietly. But Eleanor followed immediately. No more secrets. Together they descended toward the entrance hall. Blackmere Hall felt colder than before, its endless corridors heavy with silence and memory. Candle flames flickered along the walls as thunder rolled outside. When they reached the bottom staircase step, the front door stood slightly open. Rain drifted across the marble floor, yet the hall appeared empty. Graves crossed cautiously toward the doorway and peered outside. "There is no carriage," he murmured. Then Eleanor noticed something beside the fireplace. A leather traveling bag rested near one of the chairs, wet from rain. Theodore saw it too and turned pale instantly. "Impossible." Eleanor frowned. "You recognize it?" Theodore nodded faintly. "It belonged to Vivian." Silence spread through the hall. Eleanor stepped closer and opened the worn leather bag. Her mother's initials remained visible along the brass clasp. Inside rested folded clothing, old letters, and beneath them a cracked silver pocket watch. Theodore stared at it as though struck by memory. She kept this with her always. Eleanor opened the watch carefully. Hidden inside was a tiny folded note written in her mother's hand. If anything happens to me, do not trust the official account of Clara's death. Theodore knows more than he admits, but he is not the man I fear most. Eleanor looked sharply toward Edmund, but he slowly shook his head. No, he said quietly. Vivian did not mean me. Suddenly the grandfather clock began striking midnight. Deep metallic notes echoed through Blackmere Hall. During the final strike, another sound emerged beneath it. A door closing upstairs. Everyone looked instinctively toward the dark second floor, corridor above the staircase. Then came footsteps, calm, deliberate. Someone descended slowly into the entrance hall light. Eleanor's breath caught instantly. It was a woman, elderly now and dressed entirely in black. Rain still glistened across her coat sleeves, while gray hair remained pinned beneath a dark veil. Theodore stared at her in disbelief. Graves lowered his eyes. Edmund stood completely still beside the fireplace. The woman stopped at the bottom staircase step and removed her gloves carefully. Her expression carried only exhaustion. It has taken all of you far too long, she said softly. To finally speak Clara's name honestly. Inside this house again, Eleanor looked between the others. Who is she? Theodore answered in barely more than a whisper. Margaret Bell. The entrance hall remained silent except for the rain beyond, the open front door and the low crackling of fire from the distant drawing room. Margaret Bell stood beneath the staircase with calm exhaustion upon her face while the others stared at her in disbelief. Eleanor could see traces of Clara within her features now. The same serious eyes, the same quiet sadness resting beneath years of silence. Theodore spoke first, his voice barely steady. You disappeared after the inquest. Margaret removed her wet gloves slowly, because no one inside this house wished to hear the truth. Edmund turned toward her carefully. You knew Clara believed someone watched her fall. Margaret nodded once. She told me herself 2 days before she died. Eleanor stepped closer. Instinctively. Then why remain silent for all these years? Margaret's pale eyes moved toward the enormous staircase rising through the dark hall. Because Clara begged me not to destroy Vivian's life. The words settled heavily through the room. Theodore lowered his gaze immediately. Margaret continued quietly. Your mother loved Blackmere Hall once. She loved Theodore. She believed this family could survive honesty. Her expression darkened faintly. Clara knew better. Eleanor felt cold move through her chest. What exactly happened that night? Margaret looked toward Theodore for several long seconds before answering. Clara confronted him in the East Gallery. She wanted Vivian told everything about the debts, about Edmund's return, about the lies surrounding the estate. The hand tightened around his cane. I intended to tell Vivian myself. Too late, Margaret answered softly. Silence followed. Rain drifted steadily against the windows while candlelight trembled across the marble floor. Eleanor noticed Theodore looked older now than at any moment since her arrival at Blackmere Hall. Not cruel, not dangerous, simply broken by years of regret. Clara slipped during the argument. Margaret continued. The railing had loosened months earlier. She fell before Theodore could reach her. Eleanor closed her eyes briefly. Then why hide the truth? Theodore finally answered himself. Because when Vivian arrived, she believed I pushed Clara. His voice trembled faintly now, and I allowed her to believe it. Eleanor stared at him in disbelief. Why? Theodore looked toward the dark windows overlooking the rain-soaked grounds. Because Vivian also saw someone else standing in the gallery doorway watching everything happen. Edmund lowered his head slowly. Beside the fireplace, Margaret spoke quietly. The man Clara trusted. Eleanor looked between them. suddenly understanding. Graves? No one answered immediately. Then Graves stepped forward from the shadows near the staircase. His pale face revealed deep sorrow rather than fear. Clara and I intended to leave Blackmere Hall together, he said softly. Eleanor could barely speak. You loved her. Graves nodded once. Yes, Rain echoed heavily. Through the hall now as if the manor itself listened beside them. Graves continued slowly. I arrived too late. I saw Clara fall from the gallery before Theodore could save her. His voice nearly broke. And when Vivian looked at me, she understood instantly that Clara had planned to leave with a servant. Theodore closed his eyes painfully. Vivian believed the scandal would destroy Clara's memory completely. If the truth emerged publicly, expressions softened faintly with old grief. So all of you chose silence instead. Eleanor looked around the hall. At the towering staircase, the portraits, the endless shadows of Blackmere Hall. Decades of fear and misunderstanding had poisoned every room of the manor more thoroughly than hatred ever could. Then Margaret reached into her coat and removed a final sealed envelope. There is still one thing Vivian never learned. She handed the letter directly to Eleanor. Clara wrote this the morning before she died. Eleanor stared at the faded seal. Her mother's name was written carefully across the front in Clarabelle's handwriting, unopened, hidden for nearly 20 years. The storm finally began to weaken toward dawn. Rain still touched the tall windows of Blackmere Hall, but softly now, like the final pages of a long, sorrowful confession. The entrance hall remained silent while Eleanor stood beneath the candlelight holding Clarabelle's unopened letter in trembling hands. No one spoke. Theodore sat heavily beside the fireplace, exhausted beyond words. Edmund remained near the staircase shadows, distant and pale. Graves stared quietly into the dying flames as though 20 years of grief still lived there. Margaret Bell watched Eleanor with calm sadness. Clara wanted Vivian to know the truth before she left this house. Forever, she said softly. Eleanor looked down at the faded envelope. Carefully, she broke the seal. The paper inside had yellowed with age. Yet the handwriting remained steady and elegant. Vivian, if you are reading this, then I was too afraid to speak honestly before it became too late. I loved this house once because I believed it held kindness inside its walls. But secrets grow heavier here than truth. Theodore is not a cruel man, only a frightened one. Graves wished for us to leave together before the family destroyed itself, completely beneath silence and pride. If anything happens to me, promise me you will not let Blackmere Hall bury another life beneath its reputation. Leave this place while your heart is still your own. Eleanor lowered the letter slowly. Tears blurred the ink before her eyes. Across the room, Theodore covered his face with trembling hands. No one tried to comfort him. Some grief belonged only to silence. Morning light gradually entered the manor through the rain-stained windows. For the first time since Eleanor's arrival, Blackmere Hall no longer felt haunted by mystery, only by memory. And memory, Eleanor realized, could wound far more deeply than fear ever could. Several hours later, the servants opened the curtains throughout the house. Fires were relit. Dust-covered corridors no longer seemed threatening in daylight. The east wing remained quiet, though not oppressive now. Merely old. Merely tired. Theodore asked Eleanor to remain at Blackmere Hall after his death and restore the estate if she wished. But Eleanor already knew she would not. Some houses survive too long beside sorrow. Edmund departed before noon without farewell, disappearing once again beyond the rain-covered river road. Margaret Bell remained only long enough to place a white rose beneath the east gallery railing where Clara had fallen. Graves watched silently from the corridor as she left. Eleanor stood alone beside the front doors shortly before sunset. The storm had passed entirely. Beyond the dark trees, the river reflected pale silver beneath clearing skies. Blackmere Hall stood behind her in silence, its windows glowing softly with candlelight against the coming evening. A house built from secrets. A family shaped by silence. Yet somewhere within those long corridors, the truth had finally been spoken aloud. Eleanor placed Clara's letter carefully inside her coat and stepped into the cold evening air. Behind her, the great doors of Blackmere Hall closed gently for the final time. Thank you for listening to this story. If you enjoyed this cozy Victorian mystery, subscribe to the channel, leave a comment with your favorite moment, and turn on notifications for more atmospheric stories beside the firelight and rain.